just leads me closer home. Be seated, please.
Thank you, Colin. Good morning. If you get out your outline, we're starting a new series today on the future. Now, Leslie, I have to tell you something that happened to me yesterday. Yesterday, I was up here in the fellowship hall doing a small wedding for some friends. I've sort of over the years become, these are folks I met over in Pasadena in the early 90s, and I've done a lot of funerals lately. It seems like this year has been not a good year as far as people passing on. And so we got ready to do the wedding, and I looked at my notes and I realized I don't have wedding notes. I've got funeral notes up here. And then I looked at it and realized, they're really not that different type of a service. It's kind of, there's a lot of the same elements involved. So we just rolled with it in that. And so if you're here and you haven't quite got it all together this morning, just welcome. Okay, welcome. We're right with you today. And like I said, we're starting a new series on our future, on how we get to choose our future. Now, let me tell you why this is important. Because we've come out of, or we've just finished a decade of destiny that was successful it was wildly successful in terms of the goals we set and the goals we reached. We're prepared. We are entering the final 3 months, final 2.5 months of 2019. 2020 is just around the corner, and we've got a new decade, and we've got new challenges, and we've got new goals, and that's why we're deciding right now that it is time for us to start bringing this stuff forward, because we've got to make decisions today if we're going to be where we need to be in 5 years. That we've got to make the decisions that are difficult, and we've got to make them now so that when it comes to the time, we have an identity and we're clear where we want to go. Now, a lot of people have a big misunderstanding of God. Because the Bible says God planned each one of us before we were born. It goes further to say that he planned each and one of us before he actually made the earth, before he created the universe. And a lot of people think that since that God made us and knew about us and planned our days out, that everything about our lives is a preset. That there's nothing that our lives have been set for us, that there's no choice in there, that everything that will happen to you, everything that has happened to you, there's been no choice in it for you. That it's just kind of one big cosmic setup and go. And the Bible teaches exactly the opposite. The Bible teaches that God does have a plan for our life. The Bible teaches the fact that God did plan our lives before we were born and before the making of the universe. But we do this plan that we have, we can miss God's plan. We can make the wrong choices today, and we can miss God's plan for our life. You see, God said, I love you enough that I'm going to let you follow my purpose, or I'm going to let you ignore my purpose. And most people, if I can just be honest with you, most people go through life missing what God has for them. Most people go through life, and poor choice after poor choice after poor choice makes it where they totally miss God's plan for their life. Now, when Moses led the children of Israel out of captivity, they had been enslaved for 400 years. He said, we're going to a promised land. He said, let me tell you about the promised land. It's more fabulous than anything you've ever seen in your life. It is a land, it is said, that flows with milk and honey. That means there's nutrition. That means that there's everything's good, that there's sweet. You can always tell when you have enough. I'm a veteran of a lot of potluck dinners in my life. Not only can you tell that this way, but you can tell that by the fact that I've been in the church for many, many years. And third generation preacher and all that. Do you know how when you've had a potluck and there's enough food? There's a piece of white meat chicken left when everybody's gone through the line. That's when you look back, there's deviled eggs left. That's when you look through and you think, okay, we got it. So he said, you're going to this land, and it's going to be the most fabulous place you've ever seen, but it's not automatic, it's going to be given. No, you're going to have to fight for it. You're going to have to go in and you're going to have to take it. You're going to have to follow God's plans. Let's talk about God's plans for us. quickly on the screen. God's plans for us today, Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you, plans not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. But God says, in order to get that promise, because you see, whenever God gives us a promise, he also gives us a premise that we need to follow to get to the promise. So he said, listen, in order to get those things that you want, we've got to make some choices. That we've got to choose whether or not we're going to do what God says or ignore what God says. We get to choose every day whether we're going to follow him. That's why we're going to talk about choosing our future. Because God said that to Moses, but he said that to us too. Look at your outline, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 16. Today I'm giving you a choice. You can choose life and success, or you can choose death and disaster. I'm commanding you to love the Lord your God, to live the way he's told you, and to obey his laws and teaching. You're about to cross the Jordan River and take the land that he is giving you. If you obey him, you will live, and you will become, look at this, successful and powerful. There's only 2 times in the Bible where God promises his people success. This is one of them. He says, if you do what I tell you to do, then you're going to end up successful. And it's a promise, but there are a few strings attached. He says, you've got to love me. He says, I need you to love me. I need you to choose to love me. He says, you've got to obey my word. You've got to listen to me. You've got to follow me. You've got to live the way I tell you to live. And he says, if you'll do this, if you'll just do that, then you will be successful and powerful, greater than you can imagine. But he said it's a choice. It's a choice. We can either have life and success, or we can have death or disaster. It all depends on what we do. It all depends on if we're going to live the life we tell him. Look at verse 17. Because if we do, we'll be successful and powerful. If you disobey and refuse to listen, and you're led away to worship other gods, you will be destroyed. You will not live long in that land across the Jordan that you're about to occupy. I'm now giving you. The choice between life and death, between God's blessings or his curse, and I call heaven and earth to witness the choice that you make. You see, one of the greatest abilities that God has given us, humans, is the ability to make a choice. It's the ability to get up every day and choose how we're going to live our lives. We can choose to do the right thing. We can choose to do the wrong thing. That's all us. We can get our kicks any way we want to. Now, the kickbacks, we don't have any choice on that. Now, here's the thing, that God could have taken away our choices. God could have made us puppets. But he didn't make us puppets. But he could. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that God made every decision for us. Let me tell you what would happen if God made every decision for us, okay? There'd be no evil in the world. There'd be no school shootings. There'd be no racism. There'd be no terrorism. There'd be no sexual abuse. For all that to happen, all that would need to happen was for God to take away our freedom of choice. But God, in his wisdom, says, no, I want to give you the freedom to choose. I don't want to tell you everything that you have to do. I don't know how you feel, but when somebody's riding my back going, you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, I'm going to push back. And he says, I don't want to have that relationship. Love is this marvelous thing. I got to do this wedding yesterday, and I talked about the love that they have for each other. But the only thing that makes love special is when we're willing to give it to somebody. As long as we keep it in ourselves and don't give it to anybody, love does absolutely no good in the world. And so our freedom of choice, that is our greatest blessing, but it can also be our greatest curse. Because we could choose the wrong thing. Now, let me just be real clear. As James said in the communion service, there's been a lot of bad things happen to us. I'm sorry. Now, we've got some folks in here that have some unbelievable, horrible tragedy. If you know the story of Westbury, you know the story of the Sudanese folks that came over as refugees, and Isaiah Jackson, and how Isaiah has gone back to Sudan, and how he's started baptized thousands of people, and started hundreds of congregations of the Lord's church. Friday night I was over at the Jackson's house because Isaiah doesn't have long to live. Isaiah has had brain cancer, and his eyes open, but he can't recognize. He can't talk. He can't understand what we're saying. And I look at his wife and I look at his daughter and I say, I am sorry. I think of the church over in the Sudan, because they're the guy that loved them enough to come to America and then come back to them. That doesn't happen very much. The guy that loved them enough to go back to them isn't going to be able to go back to them except maybe to be buried or have his ashes spread. I'm sorry we live on a broken planet. I'm sorry people don't choose the right thing. But what happens to us in life isn't nearly as important as how we respond to what happens to us in life. You know, it's interesting because you take one person or one group of people and you put them in a bad situation and they respond in a resilient way. They respond in a way that is admirable. And then you take another group of people, put them in the exact same circumstances, and they can't make it. It breaks them down completely. It's the choices that we make, because our choices are far more important in shaping our lives than our circumstances. You see, we cannot control the circumstances that happen in our life. I've had circumstances that happened to me that I wish hadn't happened. I couldn't control them, but I could control how I reacted to them. And I could control how I responded to them. And I could control whether or not it was going to make me a bitter person or a better person, and so can you. You see, we make our choices, and then our choices make us. This past Thursday, Luis from the Spanish side and Steve and Colin and myself, we went into, we had a retreat. Somebody who's a member here has a place that they're a member of, and they reserved us a room, and man, they came in and waited on us, took care of us. They said, how do you want to pay for this? Do you want to use a credit card, or do you want to bill it to the person who reserved it for you? We said, we're going to bill it to him. And that, Calvin, I'm sorry, all right? We'll settle up later in that. No. But here's why. Here's why we did that. We discussed culture. We discussed changes. We set some goals. And we tried to look at things 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And we're considering all the choices we have right now, because the choices we made last Thursday are going to determine where we're going to be 5 years from now. So wise folks always ask the question, where do I need to be today that's going to get me where I need to be tomorrow? And it has to do with our choices. So God gave the children of Israel a choice. He says, here's what. I'm not going to force my plan on you. Oh, you see, here's the point where I would say, if you don't get anything else out of this lesson, please get this. God never forces his will on us. God never says you're going to do this my way, or I'm going to sit down and beat you up until you do this my way. He says, listen, I'm not going to force my plan on you. Okay, I want you to stop right here, because we need to do some housekeeping. Because a long time before God gave his people a choice, God gave their leader a choice. His name was Moses. And why did we, 4 preachers here at Westbury, spend a day in a room in downtown Houston deciding and praying and challenging? Here's why. Because if you're a leader, you make the difficult decisions before anybody, make the difficult choices before anybody else does. You see the things that nobody else sees. And you make the decisions on them so that the future can be set up so that we can get what we need to get done. That is the mark of leadership. So let's take a look at the choices Moses had to make in order to get him into the promised land. And now, and here's why we do that. Because if he hadn't made the right choices up to now, they wouldn't have been there. All right, now here's what we know about Moses. Moses was the greatest leader in the Old Testament. And I want you to look at your outline, because here's the story of Moses summarized in Hebrews chapter 11. And these verses talk about 4 life changes that Moses made that we need to wake up and decide to make every single day for the rest of our lives. Let's read this. And I want you to look for the 4 life changes. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By the way, the king's edict was to death for all the kids. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, and he persevered because he saw him who was invisible. All right, I want to spend the rest of this lesson looking at these things in detail because there are 4 choices that are uncovered there that you and I have to make today if we're going to get to where we need to get tomorrow. Because if we don't make them today, you're not going to be where you need to be tomorrow or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. So what did he do? First choice. Here we go. Number 1, Moses refused to be defined by others. He refused to be defined by others. You've got to make that decision every day. Who's going to define me? Because the world is full of labels, isn't it? Man, the world throws labels out at you. And we've got to teach our kids how to make that decision. And here's the thing. We can't make the decision of who we identify with or refuse to be. We can't make that decision when we're immature. That's a decision for the mature. Here's what it says for Hebrews 11:24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now here's what's going on right here. All right, Moses is in an identity crisis. Now let me just say that research tells us that most of us will go through 3 identity crisis points in their lifetime, at least 3. And the most common 3. The first are just about the time you go from middle school to high school. That's the first identity crisis. Because you're trying to find out who accepts you. You're trying to find out how you fit in. You're trying to find out where you fit in. And you know, which group are you going to hang with and which group's going to accept you. So that's the first identity crisis. That's why you see young people. One day they're dressed up in grunge clothes, and the next day they're dressed up like they're dressed up in Western, and they're trying to find their place and how they fit in. Second identity crisis that all of us face is when we've developed our career. We've gotten married. We've got a house. We've got some kids. And you know, we're looking for something that holds a little more space, so we go out and get a minivan. Only we're not going to call it a minivan, are we now? We're going to call it an SUV because that's kind of juiced up a little bit, all right? Let me just tell you right now, okay? An SUV, it's a minivan for men. That's all it is, all right? And so we get that, and we realize that we're not going to change the world. Our plans, our goals when we were in college or in high school was, I'm going to make a difference in the world. I'm going to have significance. And we realize about the time we get into that buying house, having kids, buying car, all that kind of stuff that, you know, we didn't make the difference that we thought we were going to make. And there's always this, I was talking to Dina last night, and I said, you know, most guys get about 30. They realize that they always think that in the back of their mind, they could always play in the NBA or Major League Baseball or I always go football in that. And then they get about 30 and then they realize, wait a second, every single one of the Astros, the Texans, and the Rockets are a lot younger than me, like 20 years younger than me. And I won't be able to do that in that. And it kind of settles us into the point where we're in a little bit of a crisis. Because we don't know what we're contributing to the world. We had plans, we had dreams, we had ideals, and we have to figure out what we do with that. The third is when you find yourself single again, whether by death or by divorce. And you find yourself a single person in a world that values coupling. You find yourself a single person and you don't know which class to go to here. You find yourself a single person and you're in an identity crisis. So here's Moses' identity crisis. He was born a slave. He was born in slavery. But he's raised as Egyptian royalty. He's raised as son of Pharaoh's daughter. That would make him the grandson of the most powerful person in the world. And at some point, Moses had to decide, okay, who am I? Am I a Jewish slave or am I Pharaoh's grandson? You know, am I a poor field worker, or am I a rich kid? You know, that caught a lucky break. Now he's got 2 choices. He could pretend he's royalty, but then that's living a lie. And for sure, for a while he'd be rich and famous and live in mansions and have everything he'd ever want, but he'd always live looking over his shoulder just in case somebody found him out. Just in case somebody knew who he was. I don't know if that's ever been you, but where maybe you built yourself up a little bit more than you really were, and you kind of spend your life looking behind you, making sure nobody's catching up. So the telling the truth that he was a slave would have cost him his place in the palace. And he would have had to have gone back out in the fields. And so here we have gut check time. Because you think, you know what, I can ride this wave all the way till it's over, and then after it's over, resume my place out in the fields. But I may get 10 or 15 more years out of riding this wave. But sooner or later, he realizes now he's not going to be able to surf at all. That he's going to be back doing slaves' work. And Moses decided, I'm not going to live a lie. Moses said, I'm going to be a person of integrity. He said, not just am I not going to live a lie, but I'm going to disown the royal family. He says, I'm going to insist on being who God made me. Now, let me just ask you a really important question that I don't want you to answer out loud, okay? But the question is, who are we letting determine our identity? Who are we letting determine who we are? Our coworkers, our friends, our people at school, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your husband, your wife. Who are you letting determine your identity? When I talk about other things and other people determining our identity, they call that peer pressure. And automatically, we have a lot of adults who shut their brains off because peer pressure is just for kids. Oh, wait a minute. No, adults, there's a lot of peer pressure. I see what you're wearing. I want to wear that. Yeah, I see the fashion you got. I want that fashion. I see the car you're riding in. I want a car just like that. And we let the competition determine who we are. And Moses said, I'm not going to live this lie. Here's what the Bible says in Romans 12:2. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its mold, but let God remold your mind from within so that you may prove in practice that the plan of God for you is good. Or Moses said this in Exodus 23:2. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. Paul comes back in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4 and says, our purpose is to please God, not people. He's the one who examines the motives of our hearts. You see, Jesus says this about his disciples in John 17. They are no more defined by the world than I am defined by the world. So when we settle this first choice, who's going to determine my identity? It makes us resistant to the fear of not being approved by other people. When we ultimately decide that we're going to be God's people, it releases us from the fear of what other people think about us. Let's look at the second big choice that Moses had to make, because we've got to make that one too. And it's this, and that is to choose short-term pain for long-term gain. See, because if you want to be in a different place spiritually, if you want to be in a different place emotionally, if you want to be in a different place financially, if you want to be in a different place physically, we're going to have to make some decisions that are going to cause us some short-term pain, but ultimately are going to be good in the long run, because most of our problems that we have come from what I call the inability to delay gratification. It just means the inability to wait for it, the inability to save it up for it. Queen, those great theologians, Queen, summed it up with, I want it all and I want it now, when they sang that, even if I can't afford it, according to NBC, National Broadcasting Company, NBC. And this is data from September of 2018. So this is the latest data I could get. That if you are aged, let me just tell you what I mean by we don't want to delay our gratification. All right, I just asked a simple question. Demographically broken down, what is the average debt that Americans have broken down demographically? Okay, here's your answer. If you're 18 through 24, all right, so if you're just going into college or just getting out of college, and that, you are $22,000 in debt if you're the average American. Most of that is student loans and credit cards. Okay, so let's go from 25 to 34, and your debt jumps from $22,000 to $42,000. So you're $42,000 in debt if you're 25 to 34, and most of that is credit card debt. That's the plastic. That's the revolving credit where they compound your interest daily. In that. All right, let's move on up a little bit. If you're 35 to 49, the demographic of 35 to 49, it says that you're looking at $39,000 in debt. Congratulations. In between the years of 25 to 34 and 35 to 49, you pay $3,000 off on your bills. in that. So if you want to look at a glass half full scenario, there it is. If you're the 50 and up demographic, then you've managed to reduce your debt to $36,000. So that's $6,000 from the time that you're 34 years old that you've managed to pay off on your bills. And all of this says that we are in a generation that's forgotten how to wait for something, that's forgotten how to save for something. And how many of you would agree that sometimes the right thing to do is the most difficult thing to do when it comes to our life? Let me just tell you this, okay? If the right thing were easy, everybody would be doing the right thing. Instead, we're not built like that. You attack me, I want to attack you. You criticize, because that's easy. You criticize me, I want to criticize you. That's simple. You want me to forgive you? I don't want to forgive you because that's difficult. Because the right thing is almost always the harder thing to do in the short term, but the benefits of forgiveness are in the long term. Hebrews 11:25. Moses chose, I want you to circle that word, chose, along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. Let me just stop right there and say, I love the Bible because it tells the truth. It doesn't tell lies. It tells the truth. And the Bible says right there that there is pleasure in sin. That like to blow me away the first time that I found out there was pleasure in sin. Because see, I grew up hearing that there wasn't pleasure in sin. I grew up hearing that sin ripped you apart, and it does after a time, but at the moment, I remember the first time I sinned willfully, and I thought at the end of it, yeah. And it was a little later on that I thought, no. Now, the Bible doesn't gloss over that part. Let me say this another way, okay? Is it easier to sit in your recliner with a half a gallon of Bluebell and watch television, or is it easier to turn off your television and read your Bible? All right, I'm sorry. You must be the Bible guy. I'm the Bluebell guy, okay? I want you to know that I knew you guys are better than me. I'm sorry. Your preacher is a Bluebell loving, sinning preacher in that deal. So pray for me, and let's get right back to the lesson because my shortcomings are not what we're talking about here. All right. In verse 23, we see God choosing Moses. In verse 25. We see Moses choosing God. In verse 24, Moses rejects God. Moses said, God says in verse 23, Moses, I want you to lead my people. Verse 24, Moses says, I'm not the one. I have speech impediment. I'm not a good leader. I'm not a natural leader. Then in verse 25, Moses comes back and says, God, I will lead this. I will do this. So we have a positive. God says, I want you to do this, followed by a negative where Moses said no, followed by a positive where Moses said yes. And the issue had to do with, Moses, are you willing to be responsible? Are you willing to be responsible for this million or so people that are following you as you go from here to here? Because they're going to argue and they're going to whine and they're going to moan and they're going to be hungry and they're going to be thirsty. And are you willing to take responsibility? And Moses starts off by going no and ends up by going yes, I'll do this. And when he did that, he had to realize that at that point, the buck stopped with him. And so let me ask you an important question. And the important question is, where do we need as individuals to start accepting responsibility? As people, where in your life do you need to start accepting responsibility? Let me ask it another way. Who are you blaming for your problems? You say, well, if they didn't do this, then I wouldn't do it. No, you're choosing to do that. All right, let's go up through some spiritual facts right up front. Number one, every single one of us, you're as close to God as you want to be, as you choose to be. Every single one of us are as close to God as we choose to be. We can't blame our husband, our wife, our brother, our sister. We can't blame anybody for how close we are to God. Number two, let me give you another one. You can't live off somebody else's spiritual commitment. Now, when you're young, you can live off somebody else's spiritual commitment. When Moses was a baby, he lived off his parents' faith. But when he'd grown up, he had to make his own decisions. He couldn't go to his dad and say, what do I do here? Make a decision for me. He makes his own decision. Let me give you the last one. And it's a really important one. And most of America doesn't get this. We are going to have pain in our life. There's no other way to say that. There's no such thing as a pain-free life. Now, in life, if you're young, you can take it easy and not get involved and not put in the effort. And when you're old, it's going to be a lot harder. Because when you're old, you hurt. Joints don't work like they used to. And you slacked off when you were young. Or you can get the job done when you're young so that when you're old, you don't have to you've done all the hard work. It's going to be easier. You don't have to keep having to prove yourself. Now, God makes us a couple promises about pain. Promise number one is that God says, I'll use pain to help you grow. He promised that God promised, Romans chapter 5, we could have joy in our troubles because we know that these troubles produce patience. And patience produces character, and character produces hope. So God says, you see that pain you've got, whether it's in your shoulder, whether it's in your knee, whether it's in your heart over somebody you missed, whether it's in any area of your life at all, God says that it has things that it produces that are fabulous. And then number two, he's going to reward us in heaven. This life that we're living here, it's not the end of the story, y'all. That we're going to be rewarded in heaven on how we handle the difficulties of life. 2 Corinthians 4:17, these present troubles are quite small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us an immeasurable great glory that will last forever. 2 Corinthians 4:18, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, for what is unseen, for what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So let me say this again. If you're following Christ so you won't have pain in your life, you're missing the point. We're going to have pain in our life. And if we take it easy now and avoid everything now, life's just going to be that much harder. So it's a first choice. So it's just come to choices for us. First choice is to refuse to be defined by others. The second is to choose short-term pain for long-term gain. And the third thing that Moses says he wants us to do is to choose what God values, not what culture values. Now, I said there was a fourth one. We're just going to have time for three of them today, okay? We'll come back and get the fourth one later on. Choice three, choose what God values, not what culture values. Hebrews 10:26, Moses regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Okay, Moses quit looking at the temporary. I had somebody come up to me and said, okay, tell me what the temporary is. Everything we can see. Everything we can see is temporary. This Bible, the words are forever. The paper is temporary. Microphone, temporary. We're going to be doing some stuff in our auditorium. If it was like real temporary, I'd break it for you and say, temporary. But I'm not going to do that. I'd like to. Not for any really real reason. I just would like to see what it would do. I've always wanted to throw the microphone down in that. Let me get back to this. He was looking at eternal things. So he evaluates. And he considers, and he appraises, and he makes a value judgment, and he decides what matters most. He decides in his life the most important things, and those are the things he does. You see, we get to choose our future by deciding today what the most important things in life for. If I were to ask you at the top of your outline to write down your three greatest values in life, I'm not going to ask you to. All right, I'm not asking you to, but what would they be? The three values, the three things in life you value most, what would they be? Because we've got to answer that question if we're going to be where we need to be in 2025. If we're going to be where we need to be in 2028 or in 2029, will somebody get up here and say, our decade of 2020 through 2029, oh, we didn't do so well on it. We lost our vision. Now, how in the world, if you have a year starting 2020, can you not talk about vision? So be with us as we look to choose our future, specifically as it applies to the vision of this congregation. And if you haven't made Jesus Christ your number one priority in your life, we're going to give you that opportunity now to be baptized. You say, well, I've been thinking about being baptized for a while. I know, I've been praying for you. I pray for you every day. And so make that walk. Get out of that aisle and come down here. It's not that difficult to walk. We've even sloped the auditorium down here so gravity will just propel you if you take that step. Be restored into the family of God. Place your membership here. We want you so bad to be a part of the vision that we have, to be a part of the vision that God has set for us. And we want you to be a part of this congregation as we move forward through the next decade so that it will be an unforgettable decade for every right reason. And that starts with a commitment today.